Maggie Calhoun knew how freight moved across the high, hard country of New Mexico, when most men still spoke of rail lines like a promise they hadn't been allowed to cash. She knew the angles of a contract, which merchant in Santa Fe had a conscience and which would cheat a widow blind if given the chance. She knew how to pack a wagon so that a crate of perishable medicine would survive a 2-day thunderstorm, and how to coax a mule that had been ridden hard back to the center of its stubbornness. She was 38 when the swollen river took her husband's life, her Ben, who had come home from a week in town talking of a new road, and the world swelled around her like a storm cloud. People thought that losing a man like Ben would make a woman fade into whichever house had raised her, fold into the seam of her past. They underestimated Maggie because they had always underestimated women who knew how business smelled when it was healthy. She had been doing the books for their freight line for 10 years, brown ink numbers under her careful hand. When the accident happened, Ben's wagon tipped on a slick rock and pinned him under the wheel. There were no conspiracies in town. There were only condolence pies and the slow clipping of mouths for a woman who would now be alone. But alone was a word with teeth. Ben left debts layered like dust, and a freight contract handfuls of men had been waiting to collect. The town lawyer suggested she sell, hand the wagons over, marry quick if she wanted protection. Protectors came with years of practice in taking without thanks. Maggie had tasted pity, and it was worse than hunger. She took inventory instead. She found the contracts she had negotiated a year earlier, the forward freight payments, the wagon crews who depended on the monthly pay. She understood that Ben's steady judgment had been their life's ledger. Without him, the ledger could go dark, and men with pockets quick and fingers quicker would move in. The law, when it came, had ideas of how to treat a widow with strong hands. The county sheriff called with an officious tone, a flicker of a proposition about a suitable manager, to whom she might entrust the wagons. "We can keep your people safe, ma'am, just for a while until things settle," he offered, as if anything she did needed settlement. She felt the way she had seen Ben feel when miners tried to short a load, a fire in her throat. Her voice, when she answered, was small, and it carried a command years of attention had built. "No," she said. "I have men. I have agreements. I understand numbers that read like music to men who think a widow cannot count. I will keep the line running." But the first winter after Ben's death, a flooding of officers and men from the capital started to appear, men with papers and easy smiles and a gazing entitlement that made the workers uneasy. A new federal agent arrived, young, earnest, and presented them with a different set of papers, claiming the land routes passed through a disputed grant. He proposed relocation. The movers would be paid, the wagons reassigned, the old freight roads redrawn on maps made of other people's promises. Relocation sounded like an eviction in dresses. It smelled like seating control to men who had never had the dirt under the nails they were now offering to oversee. Maggie called her crew together in the yard beside the corrals and looked at the faces she had hired, the men and women who had kept the wagons taut in wind and storm. Some were veterans, some were rough-hewn kids who liked the money and the horizon. There were 2 women among them, Lydia, who drove the forward team with the steadiness of a heart surgeon, and Sarah, a widow like Maggie but younger and quick with a wrench. "We don't move because someone says so," Maggie told them. "We move because cargo needs moving, and our customers have been trusting us to keep what matters moving for years. Ben's work doesn't die because a clerk in town takes a fancy." There were whispers. There were threats made indirectly, rolled-up threats in late-night saloons, in the loosened hands of men who washed down debts with whiskey. One night, the sheriff's deputy came by the freight yard with a polite smile and a folded paper. "There's a gunman on the road," the deputy said. "Hired help for travelers. He goes by Cole Harper. Folks say he's trouble." Maggie took the paper with a steady hand. The word "wanted" was stamped on it like a judge's hammer. There was a crime there. Someone had stolen a relay of mail and an officer had been shot. Cole Harper, the notice said, was the main suspect. Maggie read it twice. The deputy glanced at her, as if seeing whether the paper might sway her. "You could hire him," he suggested. "Keep your yard safe. Men like him attract trouble, but they keep you from getting run over." In the quiet of her office, a small room where the maps were hung and Ben's old hat still rested, the idea took form like smoke curling to a ceiling. Hiring a gunman would be the sort of thing the cowardly men of the county would expect. It would be a concession. But Maggie was never one to make a concession that let men think they could take more than they were owed. That night, she closed the ledger and thought about protection as a calculated service. If a man like Cole Harper wanted the road and had a history the county clerk found unsavory, perhaps a carefully contracted agreement, payment per trip, clear boundaries, no courting of young women in town, would make use of what he knew without conceding authority. What if he was a man with skills, not a man with a life hinged on being violent? What if he was exactly the kind of outsider who could watch the yard and keep her crews safe while she kept the contracts humming? She wrote a notice. Driver and guard needed. Experience preferred. Respect for terms required. Applied to Maggie Calhoun Freight and Forwarding. She sent Lydia to hang it in the post and left the office light on into the night. The ledger open as if Ben might return to sign his name in the margin. The fire in her throat cooled into a plan. If the town would move to take what she had by claiming it must be reallocated, she would meet the unasked-for change with tools. She would not be the sort of woman who let others decide for her. By the time the first applicant came through the gate 2 days later, dusk had boiled into the sky and the mules had loaded dinner into the dark. The gunman who stepped in was not the caricature of a wanted poster. He carried no swagger, his hat brim was plain, and his eyes were the color of river stone. His jaw had the kind of scar that read like a map of trouble. He introduced himself as Cole Harper without flourish. Maggie watched him, seeing the way his hands curled around his pack as if weighing each strap. There was an ease in his movement and a patience that read like training. He had a small wound, an old snakebite scar, halfway healed on his forearm. He was not the brigand minstrel the deputy's paper had hinted at. Payment? He asked, plain. He didn't ask for favors, didn't ask for pity. Maggie measured out the terms she had written. Routes, stops, crew respect, no drinking on the job, no crossing the line into town brawl. Cole nodded like a man who had signed agreements before and understood what a word weighed. She hired him with a handshake that tasted like a bargain. The first night he slept by the wagons, and she paid him with coin and a map of the runs. Something shifted in the yard then. 100 small prejudices began their intricate operations. Some grudges loosened, some eyes narrowed. The sheriff's deputy watched from his bar stool and the agent in town wrote notes. Maggie, who had been broken by grief and hardened by accounts, felt the old furnace of decision lightness warming inside. She had made her choice. Cole Harper's first run with the freight line was a study in quiet competence. When Maggie assigned the route to Socorro and back, she watched him load the provisions like a midwife preparing birth. Ordered, patient, precise. He checked the axles, tested the wheel hoops, and spoke to the lead mare as if reminding an old friend of a promise. Lydia watched him on the first mile out and drew a breath as if sighing over something good. The road had a way of revealing a man. Dust will tell the truth if you let it sit on a boot. They were 2 days out when the trouble found them. A narrow canyon where the map showed a river crossing, and men with faces as hard as the canyon walls stepping out from behind boulders. Bandits, Maggie thought, and her body tightened in that old, immediate way. Cole keyed a finger near his side, the movement small but practiced. He didn't go for a gun like a lover seeking comfort. He moved like a man who'd had the same argument with danger before. Maggie did not sit idle. She climbed into the front seat beside the driver, an old hand named Jefferson, and helped prod ideas. Take the high track to the ridge, unload the lead crate to make a decoy, keep noise low, send Sarah with the spare horse to circle. She had run this road more seasons than most and knew where a bandit could linger for an ambush. Cole listened to her plan and added, "You set a trap at the third boulder. They won't see the false trail. If they go after the crate, they'll leave the wagons." His words were economical. His hand was steady on the rein. They worked together like two halves of a machine aligning. Maggie's mind moved in invoices and contingencies. Cole's moved in tactics and split-second courage. When the bandits rushed the road, they found not a rattled widow and a hired hand, but a coordinated resistance. One man tried to circle the wagon and Cole's shotgun found a shoulder. It wasn't a bullet fired in anger so much as a demonstration, an edge drawn to protect. The bandits, thinking they had heard a blast and seen enough teeth in the teeth of danger, melted back into the canyon. No lives lost, only the bruising of pride. After the skirmish, while Lydia tended a cut on Jefferson, Maggie turned to Cole and examined the man who, on paper, was the wanted one. She had seen the notice. She remembered the deputy's smile. But standing in the dust with the setting sun burning behind the wagons, he was simply a man who had laid down his muscle for other people's safety. He did not speak of the alleged crime. He did not boast. Instead, he checked the pack mule, counted the bolts, and tucked an extra blanket into a crate that belonged to a grieving mother, bound for a funeral in a distant town. "Why come here?" Maggie asked at last. "You could have taken that road further north, found another job, stayed quiet." Her voice asked more than logistics. It asked about the grain beneath his life. Cole sat on a crate and looked at the wagon wheels. "Because the road struck me as honest," he replied. "You run things proper. The men look at you like they've been given a reason to keep their heads. That matters." There was a pause before he added, as if he were placing a small truth carefully. "And because I can pay my share." Maggie listened and found herself testing him with trivialities. She asked about the crime on the poster, about the mail coach holdup and the shot man. He flinched, small and human, but didn't lie. "There was a holdup," he said. "A roar, shots. But I wasn't the one to do the shooting. I was there after, that's true. I helped pull a man from the dirt. I ran when men started looking for blame." The look he gave her was honest in the way hard men understand honesty. Not polished with excuses, just the bare bones of what had been. She could have dismissed him, sent him on his way, called in the deputy to deliver on the wanted poster. But the freight yard had people who owed the line their salaries. They needed a protector that wouldn't let them be forced into relocation. Maggie weighed law and necessity like two coins, turning them in her hand until she found the edge she liked. She decided then that a wanted poster did not automatically make guilt. If the law could be cruel by default, business demanded pragmatism. Cole could be either a shield or a liability. She chose to grant him the shield of employment, but not soft-handed trust. So their alliance settled into a rhythm. They shared routes. Maggie scheduling, Cole guarding, he teaching a man how to see a trap, she teaching him how to read a freight invoice. He learned to enjoy the patience of her ledger. She learned the value of the way he observed people, the flicker he saw in a man's hand when he held a coin he meant to steal. There was a mutual respect building, thin but strong as the warp on a loom. On a stormy night, when the horses were at feed and the rain scolded the yard, a woman appeared at the gate wrapped in a blanket and carrying herbs in a small woven bag. She named herself Kiona, Comanche, and she had been watching the freight line for several moons, trading salves and stories with Lydia for supplies. Kiona's hands were the strong, sure hands of a healer who had seen too much blood to be easily shocked. She tallied wounds and ailments like a merchant tallies coin. She had been the one to save a rattlesnake-bitten man months ago, tracing the venom and murmuring a prayer in a language of the land. The man had lived because she had tended him. "You're hiring a gun," she said without preface, stepping inside the shelter like she'd always been there. She studied Cole with the same cool, folksy curiosity Maggie had. "I saw him once, when the canyon swallowed a man and left him breathing. He was not the kind of man you want to hate." Her voice held both a statement and a warning. Maggie answered for the two of them that night, and a sense of an unlikely alliance settled. Cole, the gunman with a scar and a wanted poster, Kiona, the healer who practiced on the border of two worlds, and Maggie, the widow whose wagons carried more than goods, who transported a stubborn sense of fairness. They had a strange triangulation of need and competence. The alliance would prove necessary, not because the world bowed to righteousness, but because it could be edged toward it if the right hands refused to be pushed. The safe haven Maggie carved for herself after Ben's death looked less like refuge and more like a forge. She began stepping into roles she had only rotated around before. Leader, negotiator, arbiter. The freight office became a place where her decisions set the cadence for a dozen families. She drew up schedules, rerouted a twice-weekly run to avoid a washed bridge, negotiated a lower price for feed that kept the wagons rolling through lean months. She handled late-night calls from patrons nervy enough to ask for special attention and firm enough to trust her fairness on account. The yard hummed, and under the hum, Maggie heard her own heart stitch itself back together. There were everyday tasks that moved her, small and practical. Mending harnesses with Lydia, choosing which horses to breed for tomorrow's line, keeping an eye on the wagon axle heat so it wouldn't catch fire on a long day. She learned how much of survival rests in small fixes. Bandaged toes and tight reins, a carefully balanced load, a polite deferment with a buyer who wanted credit he could not pay. Her skills were not ornamental. They held a community together. Her knowledge in business made her more than a woman running a yard. It made her an institution. She began to reclaim the house she and Ben had shared. It stayed simple, but she cleared the attic that had been a repository for Ben's hats and the ledger she had kept, trapped in grief. She sold a portion of the land Ben had leased to a man who promised to raise crops responsibly and reinvested the money into a new wagon that bore the Calhoun name painted boldly on its side. The next freight line they ran was hers by right, and the wagons bore her stamp. She felt the clothes she wore changing with her, no longer a subdued widow's shawl, but a working jacket with oil marks and wheel grease a woman earned in the legitimate labor of sustaining a business. Cole watched this transformation with a kind of reverence. He had been hired to guard the wagons, but gradually found himself roped into more. Taking inventory at dawn, helping Maggie clean accounts when the moon was late, testing the mettle of a new teamster before Maggie would sign him on. He didn't assume leadership as a man entitled to it. He asked to be of service. He admired the way Maggie sat at the table with a ledger and chewed over numbers like a person tasting meat for doneness, careful, discerning, and unapologetic. It was not that she wore power well. She had been given little reason to learn how. It was that she fit it like a glove she'd been measured for. Kiona's presence added a different texture to the yard's life. She traded salves and stitches for hospitality and a small income, and she taught Maggie to read plants by the odor of their bruised leaves. With Kiona's help, Maggie arranged a small room for the frequent travelers who were sick, peddlers with fever, a mule driver with a broken arm. Maggie learned how to create soothing broths, how to compress a swelling, which herbs to bruise into a poultice. Her hands, which had been used to signing contracts and handling coins, moved with a different tenderness when they were treating a fevered child. It was in those nights, when the wind had a way of laying its ear to the cabin walls, that Maggie began to think differently about what fueled her. She had been running a freight line out of necessity for income, for the livelihoods depending on her, for the stubborn wish of her name to endure. But as the months turned, she felt something else crest, a purpose beyond profit. She saw the townspeople lining up not just to transport goods, but to place their trust in a woman who had been made hard and had chosen a particular kind of soft resilience. She understood that keeping the wagons rolling was saving more than cargo. It kept towns supplied with medicine, letters, the bread that fed a mill worker's family. One evening, a delegation from the town came to her office with a different set of problems. A merchant who had been buying her lines carrying services for years, Mrs. Haynes, now widowed and facing a legal claim by a larger outfit, sat with her hands folded and a trembling voice. The bigger company claimed Mrs. Haynes's warehouse was on disputed land and attempted to force her out to pay a lower rent under duress. Maggie listened and watched how the men across from them smoothed their voices, their words designed to erode a person's resolve while maintaining a polite smile. She felt the old electric heat of anger flick up. Injustice had a certain smell she could sense, like a miner senses copper in rock. "What they're asking is illegal," Maggie said after a moment. "And it's cruel. They want a woman to be too tired to fight." She rose and drew lines in the ledger with a confident hand, recalculating shipping schedules to allow Mrs. Haynes to send key documents and ledgers to a lawyer in Santa Fe who might take the case pro bono. "You have clients here who won't stand for it." Her voice did not tremble the way fear trembled. It was a voice that had learned to be practical. Maggie began to see her skill set as a community asset. Running a freight business meant holding economic weight in the town. When rumors of relocation threatened the workers' homes, she did not just sign petitions. She used her contracts as leverage. She organized a coalition of small merchants who pooled their contracts and proved to the agent that moving Calhoun freight would disrupt the supply of goods to the region. She used precise ledgers and careful legal wording to counter the agent's broad claims. It was meticulous, gate-by-gate work, but it worked. The agent withdrew a planned reassignment from the nearest judge, saying the files needed further review. With each small success, her confidence grew. The widow who had once been a subject of pity became a chief mender of the town's frayed edges. She was learning how to fight with ledgers and alliances as much as with muscle and muttered threats. Her decisions were not reactionary, they were deliberate. She had not been waiting for a man to fix what had been broken. She was saving herself, and in the process, saving others. And through this work, the bond with Cole deepened. They were comrades in a cause with different tools. He was a gunman who had started as hired muscle. She was a manager who had become a public shield. Together, they made a subtler kind of revolution. There are certain parts of a man's past that sound righteous on a wanted poster, and certain parts that fall between the lines. Cole Harper's story had been printed in broad strokes. He was present at a holdup. An officer had been shot. He was wanted for questioning. But in the quiet of the yard and the lonely miles between towns, the contours of his version unfolded with more care. He did not tell the whole story at once. He let it come as slow water over a stone, patient and revealing. One cold morning, with frost making the wagon's rope edges brittle, Maggie sat with a steaming cup of coffee while Cole mended a wheel. His hands moved with a deftness that suggested he'd always done manual tasks. The sheriff's wanted sheet fluttered under a magnifying glass on the desk, like a warning about judging too fast. Maggie asked him bluntly, "People say you robbed the mail. They said a man was shot in the exchange. I want to know your truth now that you are under my pay. He paused, thumb tracing a groove in the wheel. When he spoke, his voice was low and measured. There was a relay at the old crossroads, a mail coach late with a bag of certified letters. A gang had the plan to take it. I heard about it. I rode there to see what was happening and found men who had not been content to rob mail, men who had aggression enough to shoot an officer when he came through. I tried to separate myself, tried to stop it. The shot came. I pulled a man out from under the wheel of the coach who still breathed. I ran because the law that day wanted an answer and I didn't think I'd get one. He wrapped the words in more than admission. There was regret and a fatigue that tasted of running. Maggie listened. The details mattered. The timing of the holdup, the men who had been there, the name of a leader Cole offered, Jeremiah Fox, a man with a mild veneer and a ledger of debt. She listened to how Cole had been a witness, an actor who used force to save, not to enrich himself. In the world Maggie navigated, witness could be as dangerous as perpetration. The law could be lazy, and men in position of power could fold facts like paper to hide inconvenient corners. What proof do you have? Maggie asked. She had the reckoning of business in her bones. Words were not evidence. There had to be something beyond narrative to make a case. Cole told her about a pendant he'd seen clutched in the dying man's hand, a family token he recognized in the dirt. He told her about the way one of the gang members suddenly had a bar tab that paid off a debt owed to Fox. The story twisted around a web not unlike the one Maggie had used to resist relocation. Sometimes criminals were talented at making other people the villain, and sometimes the sheriff's hand moved in the direction of the simplest culprit, rather than the true. She found herself thinking of the freight of truth that must be carried. Evidence. Cole didn't have that kind of handle on it, and he did not have the social standing to demand justice. That was where Maggie's skills served her cause. She knew how to collect data, how to collate receipts, how to make an argument that would sit with a judge. She had friends in town and in Santa Fe who owed her favors. She knew how to demand that records be checked, that witnesses be heard. She could turn the murmur into a catalog. So Cole's past, messy and complicated as it was, became a tool for Maggie. His knowledge of the outlaw networks and the men who propped up convenient scapegoats was invaluable. He could lead scouts through territory no lawman wanted to tread. He could point to names that the sheriff's men had been too polite to pursue. Maggie, in turn, used his intel to prod the legal gears. She requested a hearing and sent a writer with a stack of ledgers proving the mail coach's certified letters had been accounted for differently. She wrote letters to the editor of the town's paper calling for scrutiny. Her actions were administrative but ruthless in their logic. In private, Cole watched her orchestrate the campaign with a kind of amazed respect. He had assumed that a woman in grief might be a brittle thing, somebody to be shielded. But Maggie's brand of resilience was not the brittle sort. It was iron under oils, practical, resistant, able to be hammered into new form. He found himself learning from her discipline. Cole had spent much of his life fast and reactive, deciding with muscle what to do. Maggie taught him to measure each move. She taught him to look for leverage. And in watching her, he started to unlearn a reflex. The reflex to run. Their romantic tension was not sudden fireworks. It was a slow burn of admiration. Cole admired Maggie's refusal to accept the simple answer. Maggie admired Cole's willingness to stand where men retreated. His protective instincts didn't seek to overtake hers. Instead, they fit neatly beside each other like two hands joining to lift a weight. They began sharing nightly cups of stew and silent watching of the horizon, their conversations folding into deeper confessions. He told her stories of fights he's tried to leave behind. She told him of Ben's laugh and the ledger entries that were like prayers. There was a tenderness that had nothing to do with rescue and everything to do with shared bearing of scars. But there were moments when his outlawish past clouded the road. Word leaked of Cole's presence in the yard. The sheriff's deputy asked questions pointedly. Cole's wanted status was like a cloud that made some men keep their distance. For all that Maggie had decided to use Cole as her tool, she could also see the danger of his shadow. It could invite those who sought to use him as a wedge to push her from her own house. She had to decide where to draw lines. She would not let him be a risk she could not mitigate. She made that decision not from alarm, but from calculation. When a federal agent came down to check the Calhoun books, Maggie invited him into her office and handed him an organized stack of ledgers. She met his eye, and in that moment, she saw the briefest flash of respect for a widow who did not permit her business to be a punching bag. "We're clear," she told him simply. "If your interest is protection, hire ours. If it's to take, you'll find we'll contest it in court." The man left with a thin smile that pressed his nerves in place. Maggie had set a boundary. Cole, standing in the doorway, felt the power of a woman who used law like a weapon as much as a shield. His own story, once a weight around a neck he thought must be hidden, had begun to be a useful instrument in her hands. The deeper she dug, the more Maggie found the roots of the injustice that had threatened not only her freight line, but every small woman-run business along the route. The relocation scheme was not just bureaucratic confusion. It was a concerted attempt by a small cabal of landmen and merchants to consolidate control of trade routes and property. The federal agent who'd arrived with papers was only a pawn who liked fine pens and layers of authority to hide behind. The real architects were men who wore tailored suits in Santa Fe and smiled at the notion of a woman running a profitable enterprise. Maggie's anger at this, the righteous sort that sustains itself on a clear sense of wrong, was a new fire in her. She had lost Ben, yes, and she had buried grief with his name. But this confrontation demanded more than mourning. It demanded the kind of clarity that had once made her father a stern man of accounts and her mother a woman of strong patience. She started mapping the injustice. Who benefited from the relocation, the paper trails that led to silent partners, the men who would take what she had built if she blinked. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. Maggie knew in her bones that she could be toppled by men who conspired in the daylight, who used law as a velvet glove to smother opposition. She felt a moral imperative like a compass needle. She would not let other women, Mrs. Haynes, little Sarah's children, Lydia's aging father, be sacrificed to greed. She could not tolerate the deliberate erasure of small businesses because a few men decided consolidation was efficient. The freight line was not just her livelihood, it was a conduit of care. Her plan was meticulous. She met with a lawyer in Santa Fe who had been at the courthouse with his ear pressed to the floor for years, and who owed Ben a favor. She and Cole hunted down witnesses to the mail holdup. Kiona, with her own network of women who traded medicines and stories between settlements, helped uncover evidence of the landmen's bribery. Maggie used her contracts to show the web of dependency that would collapse if Calhoun Freight were forced to sell. She compiled testimonials, invoices, and a timeline of irregularities that made the relocation look less like a civic necessity and more like a corporate carve-out. But planning for justice is not the same as executing it, and Maggie knew she would have to take risks. The men who orchestrated the takeover had muscle, thugs they could send to intimidate, debts they could call due. One night, a fire broke out in the storehouse of a small supplier who had refused to sell to the bigger company. It was arson by pattern, meant to warn. Maggie stood in the smoke with soot in her hair and made a choice. She would not be moved. She convened a meeting of the other women in town, Mrs. Haynes, Lydia, Sarah, Kiona, and a handful of hard-faced women who ran workshops and shops. Female solidarity, she had come to realize, was not some fanciful notion. It was practical muscle. They met in the back room of Maggie's office, where the maps were not smoothed, but folded into plans. "We will not cower because they threaten," Maggie told them, voice a controlled blade. "We will gather proof. When it's time, we go to the court and we show what they've done." Kiona suggested securing witness accounts by holding a medicine day at the yard, a cover for gathering people who would otherwise be frightened to speak publicly. Lydia volunteered to keep the supplies and inventory lists in order. Sarah offered to ride with a ledger to the courthouse. Maggie coordinated payment for the ride and collected signatures. It was a network of small favors knitted into a net sturdy enough to catch a tyrant's fall. Cole observed all this and learned the contours of leadership from the woman who, until then, had been merely his employer. He did not seek center stage. Instead, he provided muscle where necessary, scouted men who could be persuaded, and blocked threats that came during the night, intimidation attempts on the yard, subtle sabotage of a wagon's wheel. He took direction from Maggie because it made sense. He trusted her intelligence because it had saved him from trouble as often as he had saved her yards. His respect for her deepened into a thing that was neither ownership nor rescue. It was partnership, yet the enemy adapted. The landmen found a veneer of legality and pushed the agent to make more formal threats. They used social pressure. They invited merchants to lunch and made ill-veiled offers to buy out contracts at rates that would solve short-term problems but collapse families on a long-term scale. Maggie resisted publicly, using the ledgers and her methodical approach to point to the consequences. Behind the scenes, she pressed the judge for a hearing and gave her lawyer enough to demand injunction. Her fight became personal when one of the hired men set a quarrelsome tone with Lydia, publicly insulting her competence and suggesting the yard would be easier to take if women learned their place. Lydia, who had guided teams like a captain for years, did not accept the insult. the two of them almost came to blows in full view of the yard worker. Maggie intervened, not by grabbing for authority, but by arranging for a duel of skill. A cart loading contest, judged by local merchants. Lydia's crew crushed the timed load. The insulted man was publicly outmatched. The subtle humiliation of a superiority attempt was reversed. Maggie's choices were not violent. They used ridicule and competence as tools to take the wind out of the men's sails. Her truth hardened into a campaign. She was no longer just protecting the wagons or her name. She was defending a community's right to exist on its own terms. The injustice had started with an agent's paper and grown into a broader plan to take land and stability. Maggie's fight was both personal and communal, the kind of battle that binds a woman's grief to a larger cause. She had been robbed of a husband. She refused to be robbed of her life's work. She bent every resource she had toward proving that her worth extended beyond the assumptions of a county clerk's pen. Maggie and Cole's relationship matured into something neither had expected, and both had, in their own quiet ways, been too proud to ask for. They were not the kind of lovers who needed to consume one another to feel complete. Their bond was built on respect, and an equality as practical as the cords that tied a load to a wagon. Cole learned to take orders without relinquishing his dignity. Maggie learned to share decision-making without feeling she was giving up the very thing that had kept the wagons and people afloat. They began to plan together with precision. When news came of a hearing in Santa Fe about the relocation, they charted out a strategy that was legal and tactical. Cole's knowledge of the men who had orchestrated the takeover allowed them to watch for dirt. Maggie's connections ensured they had the paperwork needed to make that dirt relevant. They divided tasks by skill. Cole would find the men who could corroborate that they had been offered bribes. Maggie would arrange the testimony, the affidavits, and the ledger cross-checks to demonstrate motive and pattern. Their partnership looked like two hands passing a rope, both gripping hard. As they worked, they healed together. Cole told Maggie things he had kept locked. The guilt of having run when the law wanted him for something he didn't do. The stubbornness that kept him from asking for help. She listened without pity, offering instead tools. Tell the truth to people who need to hear it, she advised. Those who profit from lies will crumble under facts, but we'll be ready to hold the door when they do. It was a practical counsel. He adopted it, and in doing so, shed a layer of shame. Maggie's teaching extended both ways. She taught Cole how to count and plan, to understand that muscle without a ledger is like a wagon without an axle. You'll get away forward for a time, but you won't stay there. He taught her how to move men who were dangerous to her cause, how to read a room, how to tell when a threat was a bluff, when it was real. His insights saved the yard more than once when a supposed ally turned out to be a hasty man who preferred the coin of intimidation to long work. Their romance was never about ownership. One night, by a fire that lit the sky like a small sun, Cole reached across the rumpled blanket and took Maggie's hand. "I don't want to be a bandage you need. I don't want to be a story you have to carry," he said, voice rough as gravel. "I want to be someone who earns the right to stand beside you. Not because you should have me, but because I choose to be there." She looked at him, no theatrical blush, but an acceptance that felt like fitting into a well-made coat. Maggie, who had in the past been considered a woman defined by her loss, found the sensation of choosing lighter and sharper than she expected. She had always set the terms in this yard. This time, she set them for love. "If you're here, be here as you are," she replied. "I am not a thing to be earned. But if you want to walk beside me, then walk like an equal. Put your hands to the ledger, not just the gun." They both laughed. And the laughter was an admission of a new kind of intimacy, one that would allow them to be flawed and powerful at once. Women around them noticed. There was a new softness to Maggie that refused to be mistaken for weakness. Kiona offered her occasional herbal remedies for the aches of a woman who worked late and rose early. Lydia traded jokes for trade advice with Cole when they were poring over wagon balance. Mrs. Haynes, who had been denied justice for years, came by to say that she had seen the two of them argue like people who shared a life but didn't try to subsume into each other. "It's good to see you both strong," Mrs. Haynes said. "It gives others hope." Their equality had practical consequences, too. When Cole's name was tarnished by the wanted notice, Maggie was clear-eyed. She did not shelter him from the consequences of the world. She set him up to fight back on his own merit. She called upon witnesses Cole had found, mounted a legal defense that exposed Joe Fox as the actual schemer with ties to the mail robbery, and used the pieces Cole had gathered to stitch a better truth. She did this not out of romantic devotion, but because she believed in truth, and because she was pledged to the people who depended on the freight line. At the same time, Cole was learning the obligation of standing by a woman who knew how to carry her burdens without asking to be saved. When the men they opposed sent a hired thug to threaten Maggie in the night, it was Cole who met him in the yard and disarmed the situation before it could be ugly. But Maggie had planned for contingencies. The hired thug found himself confronted not only by a gun, but by a ledger that had documented his employer's bribery. The demonstration was as much legal as it was physical. Both fought, Cole with skill and Maggie with proof. It was a model of partnership, each doing what she or he did best, aligned by mutual trust. As the days grew longer and their plan moved toward its culmination in court, they experienced a maturing of their emotional language. When Cole faltered, when memories of running made him uneasy, Maggie did not coddle him. She offered context. "We are what we do," she said. "Not only what was done to us. We have a chance to do better than the past. We take it or we don't." He took it, and it made him steadier. He saw that she had not come to him to fix her life, and he was not there to fix her. They stood together and saved each other by choosing to keep walking forward. There are crossroad moments that ask a person what they value: safety and the lure of a quiet life, or the risk of standing for something that could cost them everything. For Maggie, such a moment arrived in the form of an offer from the landmen. A promissory contract signed by a man whose handwriting was designed to look civilized sat in her office like a trap. The proposal, an ultimatum wrapped in legalese, offered to buy Calhoun freight at a figure that would mean a comfortable life for Maggie. It would also mean the dissolution of the workforce spread across the line, the closure of small suppliers, and the handing of the region's supply routes to men with less regard for fair trade. Maggie's hand hovered over the ink. Wealth in a single arrangement could erase the constant fight, the sleepless nights spent counting inventories, the fear that another fire might set them back months. She imagined the quiet house she and Ben had once had. Less soot on the hearth, fewer nights of counting pennies. She thought of the mule teams and the men who trusted her wages. She thought of Lydia's steady eyes and Kiona's salves. There was a chance at ease, a tempting offer for a woman who had lived in the perpetual calculus of risk. Cole, knowing the implications, sat across from her and said nothing for a time. He had seen enough to know the contours of a sell-off. It would look like peace and feel like betrayal. "You can take it," he said finally. "You can buy yourself a life that won't require nights like these." His voice was not a plea, but a presentment of reality. Maggie sat with the choice as if it were a ledger she had to balance to the last cent. She had been broken by life and rebuilt herself into a person who made her decisions from principle. Accepting the money for peace would close doors for people who had come to depend on her. It would let other men decide the fate of the small businesses in her route. It would also spare her the constant tension of the fight. The choice was entirely hers. She pictured an alternative future, a life where the freight yard continued under her name, where the wagons bore the bold Calhoun stamp, and where she and Cole could stand at the gate on evenings and watch the sun go down together, their hands dark with work. That vision wasn't an idyllic fantasy. It was one built from the facts she'd been counting and the commitments she had made. For Maggie, choosing justice over personal ease was not martyrdom. It was the kind of hard, honest decision that had defined every other true thing in her life. So she refused the men's offer. She wrote back, in the needed script she had learned in the ledger, refusing to sell. She sent the refusal as both a legal document and as an act of defiance. It made her an enemy in the eyes of those who sought to buy out the town's independence. For a moment, there was a thinness of fear. She had made an enemy of men who had great influence. Cole respected the choice. He did not try to persuade her to safety. Instead, he set about making the consequence more bearable. He mobilized the yardsmen to a defensive watch, coordinated with Lydia to harden the wagon's security, and scouted the landmen's movements. He did not assume her decision was romantic. He assumed it was moral. He stood beside her not because she had chosen him, but because she had chosen work and people and a kind of stubbornness he admired. For a short period of fierce, difficult joy, they allowed themselves quiet moments of imagining. They pictured a life where they could build a small inn at the road's turn, a place where weary drivers stayed, and where women could trade news over a steaming pot of stew without being interrupted by men with deals to make. They imagined raising a child, though neither had children then, who would grow up with a sense that a woman could keep accounts, and a man could mend axles, and that love was not a completion, but a shared carry. This calm was fragile. It existed as a brief detente before the storm. Their decision had made enemies, and enemies conspired. But for that breathing space, Maggie and Cole let themselves stand together with the taste of a future not given to them by society, but claimed by two people who had chosen to be equal partners in life and love. The rest of the world could knock on the door. In the yard, they had their plan, their allies, and their resolve. Men with tidy suits and lawyers' smiles do not like being told no, and when a woman refuses their offer, they often bring more resources to bear. The landmen called in favors they had buried for years, polished men from the county, merchants with large holdings who could be used as a plausible front, even the federal agent who had initially pushed for relocation and now found the tide of local opinion a nuisance to be managed. Their strategy was subtle. They planned to squeeze Maggie's margins, make contracts less reliable, bribe a handful of her crew to undermine her from within. The first signs were small. A supplier who claimed to have double-booked a shipment and couldn't provide feed. A banker who hinted that the line's credit was in question. A clerk who misplaced one of Maggie's crucial invoices just long enough for a payment to bounce. The men were subtle. Their instruments were paper and pressure instead of gun. That did not make them less dangerous. In a town where reputations could be destroyed faster than wagons could roll, slander was a weapon. Cole's outlaw knowledge proved essential. He tracked which merchants were linked to the landmen through common addresses and discovered that the banker's error had been prompted by a small bribe. Maggie's ledger showed a pattern if one knew where to look. She called meetings, confronted the suppliers, and confronted the banker with proof. When the banker stammered about a clerical oversight, Cole quietly leaned in and produced a man who owed the banker a favor. His presence, as much as the evidence, was a nudge that the banker did not like. But when they pushed back, the landmen shifted tactics. They arranged for a formal complaint against Cole, resurrecting the wanted poster as a cudgel. They whispered that Maggie's freight line was hiring criminals and endangering the town. The rumor felt like a cold wind on a child's face, sudden and unsettling. Women in town who were afraid of being labeled associates of notions began to distance themselves. A few men signed on with the larger company out of fear that staying with Maggie would mean losing business. It was an attempt to isolate her, to make being her ally costly. But Maggie had not built her business alone. She had constructed a network of reciprocal loyalty. The women she had rallied, Mrs. Haynes, Lydia, Sarah, Kiona, refused to be intimidated. Kiona organized a women's council to gather statements about the landmen's interference. Lydia and Sarah set up a schedule of deliveries that the community still needed that the larger company couldn't or wouldn't provide. Special runs to a remote homestead with a sick child, a delivery of seeds for a woman who refused to be bought. The solidarity of female labor became a force the men had not counted on. When the county marshal came to town to investigate, he found a different face of the town, a community that had been carefully stitched together with fairness and mutual reliance. The marshal, who had been leaning toward the landmen because of their influence, found himself listening to a mother who described how Maggie had delivered medicine to her child in a blizzard, and to a small shopkeeper who recounted how the Calhoun line had kept his shelves from going bare. The marshal's sympathies, originally stirred by who had the most official paper, tilt when faced with witness after witness, whose stories were not easily discounted. Still, the landmen could not be counted out. They brought in muscle for intimidation tactics at night, men who had seen violence be profitable and were comfortable with threat as currency. An attempt was made to unsettle the yard. A wagon's harness was cut in the night. A sign was posted accusing Maggie of paying off bandits. It was a smear campaign and a test. The women of the town did not cower. They fortified watch rotations and left lights burning at the yard. Kiona and Maggie arranged for regular attendance at the office, not to invite danger, but to show the town they weren't frightened. Cole's past became an asset rather than a liability in these moments. His knowledge of hired thugs, where they liked to drink, who owed whom money, allowed them to expose the chain behind the intimidation. He tracked unmarked wagons and found the men who had cut the harness had been paid by a middleman with ties back to the landmen. They recorded it and presented it at a hearing. The men in suits found themselves on the defensive. It was exhausting and humiliating for them. Prestige is brittle when tested by evidence and community testimony. Yet there was a new threat, one neither Maggie nor Cole had expected: betrayal. One of the younger drivers, tempted by a quick payout and weary of constant vigilance, was caught accepting coin to delay a run and leave an empty route for the larger company to sweep in. Maggie did not scream. She presented the man with cold options: leave and take no further work, or be remitted to the marshal. He chose to leave, and in that small personal tragedy, Maggie found a sobering truth. The fight would cost people, and it would force hard choices. She would not delude herself about that. As the conspirators pushed, the yard became a crucible. Maggie's resolve hardened. Her lady's handwriting that had once penned polite rejections was now a ledger of active resistance. She rallied the women once more for an action that would expose the landmen's puppet strings in the public eye. They organized a community fair, small, loud, a public showcase of what the independent town could be. The larger company's influence wilted in the light of the town's display. It had been attempting to buy a resource that had a heart. The landmen were forced to answer in public. But the battle was far from over. When the landmen intensified their legal maneuvers, they presented a final threat, an injunction that would allow them to seize the rights to the road until the court decided. If granted, it would be a legal strangulation. Maggie felt the earth shift beneath her once more. It was tempting to see the effort as futile. For a moment, she questioned whether her stubbornness could cost not only her but others' livelihood. The stakes had been jacked and the game had become ugly. She could not look away. She resolved, like a woman who knew how to mend a broken axle in the dark, to tighten every bolt and bring every ally to bay. There was a night that set the town's breath to a hush. A fire began at Mrs. Haynes's warehouse, different from the previous arsons because this one threatened to take the whole block. It started in the early hours, a small flame licking at a bale of packing straw. The alarm was raised, buckets passed, and the men who were not cowards fought back the blaze. Yet the fire spread with a ferocity that whispered of gasoline and malicious intent. For Maggie, who had a ledger full of obligations, the possibility that Mrs. Haynes might lose everything was a personal blow. She ran to the yard in her work boots and felt the cold knife of helplessness slice a memory of a different grief. They put the fire out only with great effort, but the damage was done. Miss Haynes's business wall collapsed and part of the stock was ruined. The town rallied, but the implication was clear. The campaign had become violent enough to risk lives. Men who had been waffling in their allegiance began to talk of retreat. Investors who had been waiting for stability to tip their favor saw the smoke and moved their support to the larger company. The marshal, who had been wavering, had to decide whether to press charge. His caution made sense. He'd never before been in the middle of such a tangled case, and the men who orchestrated the violence had played their cards with frightening skill. There were few hard witnesses and enough plausible deniability to make official action slow. Maggie felt the ground shift again under her feet. She had confronted legal maneuvers and smear campaigns, but not an all-out strategy meant to fracture the town's spine. This was a test of endurance. Cole found her after the fire, soot on both their faces. "We will not let them win," he promised, as if it were a mantra. He had seen enough in his life to know that a man with nothing to lose could be dangerous. His eyes were steady but even with his resolve, there were doubts. The judge's hearing was delayed. Witnesses were scared to speak. The mutilation of the warehouse had settled a chilling effect across town. Then came betrayal in a form Maggie had not fully expected. A public hearing, where a witness she had expected to have relay testimony disappeared. The man who had promised to speak changed his story at the courthouse. He said he'd been coerced into agreement with the larger company. Maggie felt the weight of that falsehood like a physical weight on her chest. Her plan was derailed. The men resurrected their suits and their charm. The judge, constrained by the legalities and by the plausible deniability pressed on by the landmen's attorneys, granted a temporary injunction that favored the landmen's control of the road. While the court's wording was careful, the result was clear. The landmen had the authority to reroute freight until the case could be properly adjudicated. Weeks, perhaps months of limbo. It felt like a death sentence for the small line. Contracts were delayed, clients switched allegiances, and the yard emptied a little each day as men sought steady pay elsewhere. The legal underpinnings of Maggie's world loosened. Cole's wanted poster resurfaced like a smell their opponents hoped would make their work smell like rot. The county's support drifted. It felt as if even the wind had turned against them. Maggie, sitting in the office surrounded by ledgers and losses, felt something close to despair. Not the flat despair of giving up, but the deep ache when the spine flexes and still holds against a sudden blow. The town had been trying. It was not enough. It was in this darkest hour that Maggie made a choice that would define both her and the community. She could have acquiesced, sold off, and saved her own skin. She had refused before, and now she could walk away. The weight of the choice returned to that ledger. She closed the ledger and walked into the yard where the remaining men and women were making fires for the night. She found Sarah and Lydia and told them plainly, "Either we come at this with everything, or we close the book. I won't see you all scattered just because men with more coin decide to press their advantage." They looked at her with the kind of understanding that felt like blood family. Lydia clasped her shoulder. "We walk with you," she said. "We have always walked with you." Cole, who had been sitting by the wagon, rose and came to stand beside her. He did not take her hand. His presence was a thing of quiet assurance, a physical statement that he would not leave her in this fight. In that moment, there was no heroics, just a stalwart decision to face what could come. They had no guarantee. They had only resolve, the kind that builds from the bottom up like a smokehouse in winter. The town had been rattled, but not broken. The days that followed were brutal and clarifying. They tightened what remained of the payroll, brought an uneven but resolute set of shipments to towns who couldn't be left hungry, and organized a counter-hearing to demand that the injunction be vacated. Kiona and the women collected affidavits, even from those who'd previously feared to speak. A young man who had benefited from Maggie's employment but had been intimidated by the landmen stepped forward and admitted to being paid to mislead witnesses. It was a small step, but it showed cracks in the enemy's armor. Maggie's darkest hour did not end with triumph. It ended with choosing to keep fighting despite the cost. She reminded herself in the early mornings as she tended to the wagons and the men why she had begun the fight at all. It was not for vengeance. It was to preserve a space in which small people, women and men, could live with dignity. She would not cede that ground. From the gravest moment, the plan to take the fight to those who had conspired began in earnest. The cornerstone of Maggie's resurgence was to make the truth impossible to ignore. She and Cole, with the Women's Alliance at the center of their maneuvering, prepared for a public hearing where witnesses would be unflinching and incontrovertible. They collected testimonies, documented the chain of payments to the hired men who had been cutting harnesses and setting small fires, and brought forward records proving the larger company's unscrupulous purchases of legal opinion. Their strategy had to be multi-pronged. Legally, they had to remove the temporary injunction and place the landmen in a position where their hand could be. Socially, they had to make the town rally in a way that would make it impossible for municipal authorities to ignore. Practically, they had to secure the yards and routes to prevent the landmen from continuing their intimidation campaign. Cole's knowledge of the men who worked for the landmen allowed them to locate a key witness, a middleman who had spoken enough carelessly to be convinced that his words might save him. Maggie led the charge with the authority of someone who knew both her rights and the town's needs. She returned to the courthouse with a thicker file than she had before and a room full of determined witnesses. Kiona brought statements that chronicled the arson attempts, and Lydia and Sarah testified about the economic disruptions they had observed. A former hired thug, resigned and finished with his ill-gotten indignities, provided a confession in return for a safety. The judge listened as men in suits tried to maintain their composure. Under the weight of the testimonies, their narratives started to fray. At the heart of the hearing, Maggie stood as the central figure, not because she had been victimized, but because she was the architect of the town's defense. She spoke with the dry precision of a woman who had always counted things. "This is not about stubbornness," she told the court. "This is about a right to operate and a right to be heard. The little shops on our route feed children in this region. When you let big men buy their way through a town, you do not protect commerce. You silence families." Her voice was not theatrical. It was exacting and anchored in ledger lines of fact. Cole took the stand with an unvarnished honesty that had become his hallmark. He testified about what he'd seen at the mail holdup, about the men who had sought to pin the guilt on him, and about the promises he had heard offered to those who would play along. He did not demand pity. He gave the court a map of reality. His presence, once a liability on paper, had become something the town needed. He had transformed from a wanted man into a credible witness, whose courage under scrutiny was clear. The landmen's men tried to bully witnesses, hoping intimidation would make their story hold. But the women who had rallied to Maggie's cause were not. Their solidarity became a force of proof. Multiple witnesses corroborated where the landmen had tried to create plausible doubt. The judge, who had at first been inclined to grant the injunction to avoid messy litigation, found that the evidence of conspiracy was substantial. The temporary injunction was vacated, and a more thorough investigation was authorized. The landmen's veneer of respectability had been scratched and found wanting. There was another battlefield in addition to the courts. Maggie and Cole knew that reputations were as important as rules. They organized a public event, a day where small merchants from across the region would meet at Calhoun Yard to barter and discuss the free flow of. It was a show of economic independence and community. The day was a merchant after merchant declared their trust in Maggie. Farmers shook their hands and promised to continue doing business with the Calhoun line. The larger company, looking on, was forced to stand down publicly as their claims became less tenable in the face of collective economic will. In the weeks that followed, the town's power shifted again. Societies of men in suits who had hoped to shrink the little businesses found their influence waning as legal investigations revealed irregularities. The middleman who had once been paid to intimidate testified and turned state's evidence, and several of the landmen's more unscrupulous methods were exposed. The judge issued a final decision that favored the free operation of the Calhoun routes and imposed fines on those who had orchestrated this. But victory was not a clean. The town had been hurt in the struggle. Some businesses had closed, a few people had chosen to go away, and scars stayed. Yet the core of the community remained intact. When the legal dust settled, the yard hummed with renewed activity. The wagons were loaded again with more determination than routine, and the crews who had stood with Maggie found new strength in the knowledge that their work had meaning beyond profit. Maggie had become the hero of her own story, not by accident, but by design. She led a charge that used intellect, solidarity, and restrained force to protect what she and her neighbors had built. Women across the region began to talk about the woman who had refused to sell out, who had used her skills to knit a town together. Cole stood beside her at the gate as the wagons left, watching the horizon with a quiet hope. He had earned a place at her side. Their partnership was no tidy fairy tale. It was a mutual recognition of worth and a shared responsibility for what came next. The victory was not only legal, it was ethical and social. When the court issued its final ruling, it did more than return immediate control of the routes to the rightful owners. It set a precedent. The landmen were fined, some were indicted, and several businesses that had colluded were publicly reprimanded. News of the ruling spread like a clear signal to other towns facing similar pressures. Small communities could stand up and win when they coordinated their truth into a form a judiciary could not ignore. Maggie walked into the courthouse that day, not as the trembling woman who had once been offered a suitable manager, but as a leader whose name carried. The judge read through the evidence, ledgers, affidavits, witness statements, and pronounced a judgment that protected rural freighting as an independent enterprise in the. It was a legal victory, but its practical consequences were deeper. Merchants returned, shipments resumed, and the yard's profit margin rebounded. Cole's name was cleared publicly of the mail coach holdup in the lengthy procession of testimony that revealed Fox and his men as the real perpetrators. It was an awkward day. The man who had once been wanted for a crime he did not commit watched the court return his reputation to him. He accepted the restoration with an evenness that suggested he understood the hollow nature of victory. "Names are tricky," he said to Maggie afterward. "They mean more than a letter on. But labels don't have to last forever if people witness the truth." The townspeople celebrated in quiet and noisy ways. There were 3 nights where the saloon was filled with laughter and hands on the table. There was a small parade where children waved homemade flags with the Calhoun logo. But perhaps the most meaningful celebration was the one Maggie organized in the yard, a day of free rides for the children, a luncheon for the women whose livelihoods had been under threat, and the presentation of a new wagon to the. She had bought the new wagon with a portion of the fines levied against the landmen, and it was a symbolic act. She invested their victory back into the community. This was not to suggest that Maggie became a person without flaws or without scars. The truth was that the fight had taken its toll. She had lost people along the way, and the wear of vigilance had deepened the lines near her eyes. But what had changed was her posture toward the. She had started as a widow who might have been cowed by official pressure and had become a woman who could marshal evidence and hearts to protect what she loved. Her voice carried as it had not before. When she spoke, people listened not out of deference to gender, but out of respect for capability. Cole's redemption paralleled, but did not eclipse. He had gone from suspect to credited ally, and in doing so had shed the self-loathing that once had him running from his. He had found steadiness in Maggie's stead and purpose in the franchise they were now both. He had saved lives with his gun in his hands, and had learned that doing so for reasons beyond mere survival gave those acts. Their romance matured into an honest partnership. They would talk sometimes about the future in a way that threaded in honest fear and honest hope. Women who had watched Maggie rise found their own courage. Haynes reopened her shop with a renewed focus. Lydia began to train young women in driving teams, and Kiona, the Comanche healer, set up a tent where she taught other women local herbs and techniques for. There was more than just commerce at stake. There was the reassertion of female competence in an area that had once chafed against their involvement. Maggie's leadership had told them something about what was possible when women's labor was recognized not as incidental, but as essential. The town's victory also had ripple effects beyond its. Other settlements heard of the fight and reached out for advice. Maggie was practicable in her counsel. "Keep your records," she told them. "Don't cede the ledger to those who will misrepresent your worth. Build ties and tell your story loud enough for the judge to hear." It was a simple formula rooted in hard-earned experience. Justice, Maggie discovered, did not always come in a single sweeping moment. Sometimes it was a series of small measures that became irreversible because they were thorough and She had learned to use the tools she had: ledgers, empathy, coercive exposure of bribery, and alliances among women, to win in a society that often preferred to make women into characters rather than actors. She had become the actor rather than the character. Years passed and a certain peace settled into the yard like a comfortable. Maggie, now 44, moved through her life with a quiet authority that came from experience and choice. The Calhoun name had become a brand of honest freight. The wagons bore the painted name with pride, and the routes that had once been contested hummed with regular. She and Cole married on a brisk autumn morning with a small ring and the blessing of people who had walked with them through the. It was not a marriage of rescue, but of mutual respect. Both entered as equals, each bringing a life of scars, lessons, and competence. They bought a stretch of reclaimed land out by the bluff and built a house large enough for the yard's meetings and small enough for privacy. The home had room for the ledgers and a corner where Kiona kept her jars of salves and the herbs that had become famed in the county. They planted a small vegetable garden and a line of pears. They invested in the wagons and expanded the line thoughtfully, hiring women and men who had been through the fight to keep the quality. Financial independence had been critical for Maggie's transformation. She had rebuilt from the ashes not by selling out, but by reinvesting and expanding. The new wagon they presented at the town fair had become a symbol of a community that refused to be bought. She had a small savings account and investments in a co-op that supported small supply. It was practical independence, an asset base she could pass on to younger women who needed a start. Her leadership continued. She convened periodic councils where women could bring their concerns about school fees, about fair prices, about health. She helped form a fund to make microloans available to female entrepreneurs who wanted to open bakeries, to buy a new wheel for a buggy, to start a small seed exchange. Maggie had learned that power was not just about winning a single case, but about making structures that supported. Her transformation was visible in her clothes and posture. The widow's quiet dress was replaced by sturdy jackets and a set of gloves that had been worn into perfect shape. She moved with the kind of economy of motion that comes from daily work. Her hair was streaked with silver now, and she wore it tied back. Her eyes were the same color as a winter dawn, clear and. People who had known her before said she had not become softer but more exact, more generous in a controlled. Cole worked at her side with an unquestionable devotion that never smothered her autonomy. He still rode out with the wagons often, protecting the lines and training men and women in the ways of safety. He volunteered to mentor younger men who had been tempted by a violent past. He and Maggie built their life together with deliberate equality. He did not manage her, nor she. When issues arose, business disputes, personal grudges, they negotiated. Theirs was a marriage of equals who chose each other every day. Female solidarity remained a pillar of the. Lydia ran the training program for Teamsters, teaching both men and women how to manage loads, how to read a road, how to mend a wheel in the rain. Kiona's clinic became a place of healing and shared knowledge, and Mrs. Haynes reopened her shop and hired girls who might otherwise have had no. The town, under Maggie's continued attention, became a beacon for other communities. As for Cole's redemption arc, it was not a neat conversion, but a steady reorientation of a man who had seen his reputation returned and chose to build from that return a life of utility and. He and Maggie would sit at night on the porch, a cup of coffee between them, and speak in the kind of quiet conversational cadence that signals full. He would say things now like, "We chose this," and she would nod, and between the nod and the silence, there was mutual gratitude. Their love was not a thing of fevered passion recounted by nods. It was the daily honoring of each other's. It showed in how they handled arguments, quick, civil, resolved by mutual. It showed in the way Cole would, without fanfare, sit at the table and balance accounts when Maggie had to take a trip to. It showed in the way Maggie would check a sling Cole had fashioned for a mule and suggest a simple reinforcement. They were each other's equal, and in that equality lay their greatest intimacy. Maggie also became an inspiration. Younger women arrived at the yard seeking mentorship. She taught them how to read accounts, how to set prices, how to negotiate. She taught them to be fierce but not cruel, principled but not. She shared with them the simple truth she'd learned, that a woman could be both loving and fierce, and that strength was not an absence of tenderness, but its Her lasting legacy was not solely in the wagons or the co-op, but in the idea that a woman had fought and refused to cede space intended for her. She had turned a moment of loss into a lifetime of service, and had, in doing so, changed the odds. She did not become a perfect heroine. She retained stubbornness that sometimes annoyed friends and a trait of taking on too much. But she was whole in a way that came from choosing her life every day. And so her story ends where yours continues. She was told she was broken, but she proved them wrong. She was left for dead by circumstances, but she rose stronger. She was meant to be small and silent, but she roared in ledgered truths and community. If you're a woman who's been knocked down but refused to stay down, if you believe it's never too late to claim your power, if you know that the strongest love is built between equals who make each other better, then you've found your... Subscribe to witness more legends of women who refused to be victims, who turned pain into power, who wrote their own... Like this story, if you believe every woman deserves a second chance at happiness on her own, share it with every woman who needs to remember her own strength. Hit that bell. Because these stories aren't just entertainment, they're reminders that you're stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and deserving of a love that sees you as the hero you truly are.